The ink was still wet on the marriage certificate when Bartholomew Hartwell realized his life had been sold for the price of his father's gambling debts. The 25-year-old man stood at the altar of Millgrove's weathered chapel, his calloused hands trembling as the 70-year-old justice of the peace pronounced him husband to Ophelia Ravencrest, a woman whose steel-gray hair and shrewd amber eyes spoke of decades he hadn't even lived. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Whitmore announced, his voice echoing through the nearly empty chapel where only creditors and witnesses had gathered to observe this peculiar union. Bartholomew hesitated, his youthful face pale with shock and humiliation. Ophelia, dressed in an elegant burgundy silk dress that cost more than most families in Millgrove earned in a year, stepped forward with surprising grace for her advanced age. She placed one jeweled finger beneath his chin, lifting his face to meet her penetrating gaze. "Courage, young man," she whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her orders followed. "This arrangement serves purposes you don't yet understand." The kiss was brief and formal, but Bartholomew caught something unexpected in her eyes, not the predatory satisfaction he'd feared, but a calculating intelligence that seemed to be evaluating him like a piece of valuable property. Behind them, his father Ezekiel shuffled his feet nervously, clutching a leather pouch that contained enough gold coins to settle his catastrophic poker losses and save the family farm from foreclosure. "The debts are cleared," Ophelia announced. To the small assembly, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel's modest interior, "Mr. Hartwell Sr., your obligations to the gentleman from Chicago are now my responsibility. Your son's obligations, however, are to me alone." Bartholomew's stomach lurched as the full implications of his situation became clear. He had been traded like livestock to satisfy his father's weakness for cards and whiskey. The woman he'd just married could have been his grandmother, and everyone in Millgrove would know that he'd been bought and paid for like a prize bull at auction. Ophelia's carriage waited outside the chapel, a magnificent black lacquered vehicle pulled by matching Arabian horses that must have cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. The interior was appointed with velvet cushions and crystal fixtures that spoke of wealth beyond anything Bartholomew had ever imagined. As they rode toward her estate on the outskirts of town, she studied him with the same calculating expression she'd worn at the altar. "Tell me about yourself, Bartholomew," she said, settling back against the plush cushions. "Your education, your skills, your ambitions, assuming you have any beyond avoiding your father's creditors." Heat rose in his cheeks at her casual dismissal. "Of his circumstances, I can read and write," he said stiffly. "I know farming, carpentry, and horse handling. I had plans to start my own business before—" he gestured helplessly at the ornate carriage interior. "Before your father's gambling addiction destroyed those dreams," Ophelia finished matter-of-factly. "Yes, I'm quite familiar with the details of your family's financial ruin. What you may not realize is that I didn't choose you randomly from a list of available young men. I have very specific requirements for this arrangement, and you possess certain qualities that make you uniquely suitable for my purposes." The carriage turned through an impressive iron gate and up a tree-lined drive that led to a mansion unlike anything Bartholomew had ever seen. 3 stories of white stone and gleaming windows rose from perfectly manicured grounds, with stables and outbuildings that looked more prosperous than most of Millgrove's main street. Whatever Ophelia Ravencrest's plans might be, she clearly possessed the resources to implement them on a grand scale. "Welcome to Ravencrest Manor," she said as footmen appeared to assist them from the carriage. "Your new home, and the place where you'll discover exactly what I intend for our unusual partnership." The interior of Ravencrest Manor overwhelmed Bartholomew's senses with its opulence and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, while oil paintings in gilded frames depicted scenes of European grandeur that seemed impossibly distant from rural Indiana. Servants moved through the halls with practiced efficiency, their uniforms immaculate and their manner suggesting this household operated according to exacting standards. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters," Ophelia announced, indicating a stern-faced woman whose gray dress and imposing bearing marked her as the head housekeeper. "We dine at 7 sharp. Appropriate clothing has been provided, I trust. You can manage formal attire without assistance." Before Bartholomew could respond, she had swept away up a grand staircase, leaving him to follow Mrs. Pemberton through corridors lined with bookcases and curiosities that spoke of extensive travel and sophisticated tastes. His room turned out to be larger than his family's entire farmhouse, complete with a 4-poster bed, writing desk, and wardrobe filled with clothing tailored to his exact measurements. "How did she know my size?" he asked the housekeeper, running his fingers over shirts. Made from fabric finer than anything he'd ever owned, Mrs. Pemberton's expression remained professionally neutral. "Mrs. Ravencrest is very thorough in her preparations. Sir, she's been planning this arrangement for considerably longer than you might suppose." The woman's tone suggested depths of knowledge. She wasn't prepared to share with the newest resident of the manor. Left alone to change for dinner, Bartholomew examined his luxurious surroundings with growing bewilderment. The woman who had purchased him like property had nevertheless provided accommodations fit for nobility. The contradiction puzzled him. If Ophelia intended to treat him as little more than an expensive possession, why go to such elaborate lengths to ensure his comfort? A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he called, expecting Mrs. Pemberton or another servant. Instead, a young woman about his own age stepped into the room, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple white cap and her dress marking her as one of the household staff. But something in her manner suggested she held a position of particular trust within the manor's hierarchy. "I'm Isadora Blackthorne," she said, offering a slight curtsy that seemed more courtesy than genuine. Deference. "I serve as Mrs. Ravencrest's personal secretary and confidant. She asked me to brief you on the evening's expectations and answer any immediate questions about your new situation." Bartholomew studied the young woman carefully. Isadora possessed intelligent green eyes and spoke with an education that seemed unusual for a servant. Her presence in his private quarters suggested she enjoyed unusual privileges within the household structure. "What does she want from me?" Kay asked bluntly. "This whole arrangement makes no sense. A wealthy woman my grandmother's age doesn't need to buy herself a husband." Isadora's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Ravencrest's motivations are complex. But I can tell you that your marriage serves purposes beyond simple companionship. She has business interests that require certain social appearances. A respectable young husband provides legitimacy for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention." "What kind of activities?" "The kind that have made her one of the wealthiest women in 3 states, Isadora replied carefully. "Mrs. Ravencrest didn't inherit her fortune, Mr. Hartwell. She built it through intelligence, determination, and a willingness to pursue opportunities that more conventional people would consider impossible." The implications of this revelation began to dawn on Bartholomew. His elderly wife wasn't simply a wealthy widow looking for companionship. She was apparently some kind of entrepreneur whose business dealings required the social respectability that marriage to a younger man could provide. "And my role in these business activities?" Isadora smiled for the first time since entering his room. "That depends entirely on how quickly you learn and how well you adapt to your new circumstances. Mrs. Ravencrest believes you possess potential that goes far beyond your current station. Whether you fulfill that potential will determine whether this arrangement becomes a prison or an opportunity." As evening approached, Bartholomew dressed in the finest clothes he'd ever worn while pondering the mysterious woman who now controlled his destiny. Whatever Ophelia Ravencrest's specific plans might be, it was becoming clear that she saw him as more than just a decorative young husband. The question was whether he possessed the intelligence and courage to discover exactly what she had in mind for their unusual partnership. The dining room at Ravencrest Manor could have accommodated 20 guests. But tonight only 2 places were set at the polished mahogany table, one at the head and another to the right, suggesting Ophelia intended to treat her new husband as more than mere ornament. Candles flickered in silver candelabras while servants moved silently through the shadows, attending to details with choreographed precision that spoke of years of practice. Ophelia entered, wearing an evening gown of midnight blue silk that transformed her from the aristocratic elegance. Her silver hair was arranged in an elaborate style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her amber eyes, and jewelry that must have cost a fortune caught the candlelight with every movement. "You clean up remarkably well," she observed, taking her seat with fluid grace while studying Bartholomew's appearance in his formal attire. "Good breeding shows, regardless of circumstances. Your mother came from respectable stock before she married beneath her station." The casual reference to his family history startled him. "You knew my mother?" "I make it my business to know everything relevant to my investments," Ophelia replied, signaling for the first course to be served. "Your mother was Constance Fairfax, before her marriage daughter of a professor who lost his position due to certain radical political views. She could have married well, but chose love over security. Admirable, if impractical." The soup course arrived in porcelain bowls, decorated with gold leaf, accompanied by wine that probably cost more than Bartholomew's family spent on food in a month. He ate carefully, aware that his table manners were being evaluated along with everything else about his character and background. "Why does any of this matter?" he asked when the servants had withdrawn to prepare the next course. "My parentage doesn't change the fact that I'm here because my father couldn't stay away from poker games." Ophelia's laugh held genuine amusement. "On the contrary, your parentage is precisely why you're here. Intelligence, integrity, and proper breeding can be temporarily obscured by poverty, but they cannot be permanently destroyed. Your father's weaknesses created an opportunity for me to acquire something far more valuable than money could normally purchase, which is a partner," she said simply. "Not a husband in the conventional sense, but someone with the potential to understand and participate in enterprises that require both intelligence and absolute discretion." She paused as servants brought the main course, roasted duck with accompaniments that represented culinary sophistication far beyond anything available in Millgrove's modest establishments. During the meal, Ophelia began to reveal the scope of her business activities. She owned shipping interests in 3 states, maintained correspondence with investors in New York and Chicago, and had somehow accumulated detailed knowledge about political and economic developments that wouldn't reach most people for weeks or months. Her conversation revealed a mind that processed information with calculating precision while maintaining awareness of opportunities that others couldn't even perceive. The railroad expansion westward is creating unprecedented opportunities for those with sufficient capital and foresight, she explained while cutting her duck with surgical precision. Land speculation, supply contracts. Transportation monopolies' fortunes are being made by people who understand that America is changing faster than most politicians realize. Bartholomew found himself drawn into the conversation despite his initial resentment. Ophelia's analysis of economic trends and political developments displayed an intelligence that commanded respect, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. She spoke of senators and business leaders as if she corresponded with them regularly, dropping casual references to information that suggested connections extending far beyond rural Indiana. "You're not just wealthy," he realized as the meal progressed. "You're connected to people who shape policy and control resources on a national scale." Her smile held satisfaction at his perception. Wealth without influence is merely hoarding. Bartholomew True power comes from understanding how to use resources to create more resources, while maintaining the relationships necessary to protect and expand one's interests. As dessert arrived, something elaborate involving imported chocolate and berries that must have been transported from great distances. Ophelia's tone became more personal. "I'm 70 years old, with no heirs and no family beyond distant cousins, who would squander everything I've built within 5 years of my death. This marriage serves my immediate business needs, but it also represents an investment in the future. Your education begins tomorrow." The implications of her statement settled over Bartholomew like a warm cloak. This wasn't simply about providing social respectability for a wealthy widow's business dealings. She was offering him an apprenticeship in enterprises that could transform his life completely. "What exactly will you teach me?" "Everything," Ophelia replied. "How money really works, how power is accumulated and exercised, how to recognize opportunities that others miss, and most importantly, how to build something that will outlast your own lifetime." The library at Ravencrest Manor contained more books than existed in all of Millgrove combined, their leather spines creating walls of knowledge that seemed to mock Bartholomew's limited formal education. Ophelia had summoned him here at dawn, dressed in practical clothing that suggested today's lessons would be different from the elegant dinner conversation of the previous evening. Reading is fundamental, but understanding is what separates the successful from the merely literate, she announced, pulling volumes from shelves with practiced familiarity. "These ledgers contain records of every business transaction I've conducted for the past 20 years. Your first assignment is to analyze them and explain the patterns you discover." The account books revealed a complexity that staggered his comprehension. Ophelia's enterprises extended far beyond simple investments. She had financed railroad construction, speculated in grain futures, loaned money to politicians during election campaigns, and somehow managed to acquire detailed, advanced knowledge of government policy changes that affected land values and commodity prices. "How is this possible?" he asked after spending hours trying to understand the intricate web of transactions. "You're making decisions based on information that wouldn't normally be available for weeks or months." Ophelia looked up from the correspondence she'd been reviewing at her desk. "Information is the most valuable commodity in any economy, Bartholomew. People who control information can predict and profit from changes that devastate everyone else." She gestured toward stacks of letters bearing postmarks from across the continent. "I maintain correspondence with over 200 individuals in positions of influence. Telegraph operators, government clerks, railroad executives, newspaper editors, people who see important information before it becomes public knowledge." The scope of her intelligence network was breathtaking. Ophelia had systematically cultivated relationships with individuals whose positions gave them access to information that could affect markets, policy, and economic opportunities. She knew about crop failures before farmers in affected regions, understood political developments before newspapers reported them, and possessed advance notice of business decisions that would change entire industries. "This is how you've become so wealthy," he realized. "You don't just invest money, you invest it based on knowledge that gives you advantages over everyone else. Knowledge is power, but applied knowledge is wealth," she confirmed. "The railroad companies pay me consulting fees because my information helps them choose routes and schedules that maximize profits. Politicians seek my advice because my network can provide early warning about public sentiment and opposition activities. I've become indispensable to people who shape the future of this country." Over the following weeks, Ophelia's education program intensified. Mornings were devoted to studying her business records and correspondence, learning to recognize patterns, and understand the complex relationships between different economic factors. Afternoons brought practical instruction in everything from contract negotiation to the subtle art of extracting information from casual conversation. "Isadora," Blackthorne proved to be an invaluable teacher in these practical skills. The young secretary possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Ophelia's business operations and demonstrated techniques for managing correspondence, maintaining financial records, and coordinating the logistics of enterprises spread across multiple states. Mrs. Ravencrest sees potential in you that goes beyond simple assistance with her current activities, Isadora explained during one of their working sessions. She's building something larger than herself, and she needs someone intelligent enough to help expand it and eventually inherit it. The realization struck Bartholomew with unexpected force. Ophelia wasn't simply training him to be a useful husband or business assistant. She was preparing him to eventually take control of her entire network of enterprises. The woman who had purchased him to settle his father's debts was offering him an opportunity to become one of the most powerful individuals in the rapidly expanding American economy. "Why me?" he asked Isadora during one of their evening conversations. Surely she could have found someone with better education and more sophisticated background. Their first appointment was with representatives of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, whose expansion plans would affect land values and transportation costs across the entire region. Bartholomew watched in fascination as Ophelia negotiated terms that seemed to benefit everyone involved while ensuring her own enterprises would profit regardless of whether the railroad's expansion succeeded or failed. "The key to sustainable wealth is diversification with guaranteed outcomes," she explained later. "I'm financing part of their expansion, leasing them right-of-way through property I own, and providing supplies through companies I control. Whether their profits exceed expectations or fall short, my returns remain secure." The second day brought meetings with grain merchants and commodity speculators who relied on Ophelia's information network to make profitable trades. Bartholomew observed how she shared carefully selected intelligence while extracting information that would guide her own future investments. Every conversation served multiple purposes, building relationships while gathering data that would inform business decisions for months to come. But it was during the third day that Bartholomew truly understood the scope of Ophelia's influence and ambitions. Senator Jonathan Aldrich, one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, arrived for what was presented as a social call but quickly revealed itself as a strategy session about upcoming legislation that would affect industrial development throughout the Midwest. The Transcontinental Railroad completion will transform everything west of the Mississippi, Aldrich explained during their private dinner. Land values, population movements, resource development fortunes will be made by people who position themselves correctly before the changes become obvious. Ophelia's response demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed even the experienced senator. She proposed a complex arrangement involving land purchases, supply contracts, and political advocacy that would benefit multiple parties while ensuring her own network profited from every aspect of westward expansion. "Your husband seems remarkably well-informed for someone so young," Aldrich observed, addressing Ophelia but studying Bartholomew with calculating eyes. "Bartholomew has proven exceptionally capable at understanding complex situations and identifying opportunities that others." Miss Ophelia replied smoothly. "I expect his contributions to our enterprises will become even more significant in coming years." That evening, alone in their suite, Ophelia revealed the full extent of her plans for their partnership. "I'm 70 years old, Bartholomew. In 10 years, I'll be 80, assuming I live that long. The network I've built requires someone young enough to maintain relationships with people who are just beginning their own careers. Someone who can adapt to changes I may not even recognize." She handed him a legal document that had been prepared by Chicago's most prestigious law firm. "This establishes you as my full business partner, with authority to act on behalf of all our enterprises. More importantly, it ensures you'll inherit everything if something happens to me." Bartholomew stared at the papers that would transform him from a purchased husband into one of the wealthiest most influential individuals in America. Why are you doing this? Because I've discovered something I never expected when I arranged our marriage. Ophelia replied, her voice carrying unusual emotion. I found someone worthy of everything I've built. Someone who understands that wealth and power are responsibilities, not just privileges. During their return journey to Indiana, Bartholomew found himself sitting beside Isadora in the observation car, watching the countryside roll past while contemplating the magnitude of what had transpired in Chicago. She's not just giving you her businesses, Isadora observed quietly. She's giving you the chance to build something even larger. The question is whether you're prepared for that responsibility. Looking at the young woman who had become his teacher, confidant, and something approaching a friend, Bartholomew realized that his future held possibilities he'd never dared imagine. But he also understood that success would require wisdom, courage, and partnerships with people who shared his vision for what American enterprise could become. Summer brought a crisis that would test both Bartholomew's business education and his growing understanding of the complex relationships within Ophelia's household. A banking panic in New York threatened to destroy several of their most important investments, while political opposition to the railroad expansion projects put their government contracts at risk. For the first time since their marriage, Bartholomew saw genuine concern in his formidable wife's amber eyes. 30 years of building, and it could all disappear in 6 months, Ophelia confided during one of their evening strategy sessions. The banks are calling in loans, politicians are reconsidering commitments, and competitors are circling like vultures, waiting for us to show weakness. Working 18-hour days, Bartholomew threw himself into crisis management with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He coordinated with their network of informants, negotiated emergency financing arrangements, and traveled constantly between meetings with creditors, partners, and government officials. The shy farm boy who had been sold to settle gambling debts was emerging as a capable business leader under the pressure of potential catastrophe. It was during one of these exhausting weeks that he realized his feelings toward Isadora had evolved far beyond professional collaboration. She had worked beside him throughout the crisis, demonstrating intelligence, loyalty, and grace under pressure that made him understand why Ophelia trusted her with the most sensitive aspects of their enterprises. "You've changed," Isadora observed. One evening, as they reviewed correspondence in the library, 6 months ago, you were overwhelmed by the complexity of Mrs. Ravencrest's businesses. Now you're managing crisis situations that would challenge men with decades of experience. "I've had exceptional teachers," Bartholomew replied, looking up from the financial reports to meet her green eyes. "Both of you have shown me capabilities I never knew I possessed." Something in his tone made Isadora pause in her own work. "Mrs. Ravencrest sees you as the heir to everything she's built. But what do you see when you look toward the future?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business partnerships. Bartholomew set aside his papers and moved to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds while considering how to express feelings that had been growing stronger with each passing day. "I see opportunities to build something even larger than what Ophelia has created," he said finally. "But I also see that success means nothing without people who matter enough to share it with." When he turned back toward Isadora, he found her watching him with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what he was trying to communicate. "The marriage you were forced into, does it prevent you from choosing your own emotional attachments?" she asked quietly before Bartholomew could respond. Ophelia's voice interrupted from the library's entrance. "It most certainly does not," she said, stepping into the room with a smile that suggested she'd been listening for some time. "In fact, I've been hoping this particular attachment would develop." Both younger people stared at her in confusion and embarrassment. Ophelia's laugh held genuine warmth as she approached the desk where they'd been working. Did you think I was blind to what's been happening between you two? Bartholomew, you're a married man in name only. Our arrangement has always been about business and inheritance, not romance. Isadora, you've been devoted to this household for 5 years, and you deserve happiness with someone worthy of your intelligence and character. She paused beside Bartholomew's chair, placing one jeweled hand on his shoulder. I'm an old woman who married a young man for practical reasons. But I'm not so selfish as to deny him the love he deserves simply because it serves my business interests to call him my husband. The revelation that Ophelia had not only anticipated, but encouraged their growing attachment removed the last barriers to feelings that had been building throughout their months of working together. Isadora's smile transformed her serious face into something radiant, while Bartholomew felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally lift from his shoulders. However, Ophelia continued with a return to her characteristic authority. This household operates according to certain standards of discretion and propriety. Any relationship between you two must be conducted with appropriate consideration for social expectations and business necessities. Over the following weeks, as their crisis management efforts began to show success, Bartholomew and Isadora's partnership deepened into something that balanced professional collaboration with personal affection. They worked together with increasing effectiveness, their different strengths complementing each other, in ways that made their combined efforts more powerful than either could have achieved alone. Ophelia observed their developing relationship with satisfaction that went beyond mere business considerations. She was witnessing the emergence of a partnership that could sustain and expand her life's work long after she was gone. 2 years after their unconventional marriage, Bartholomew Hartwell stood in the same Chicago hotel suite where he'd first understood the true scope of Ophelia's empire. But now the documents spread across the mahogany table bore his signature as senior partner in enterprises that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the emerging territories of the American West. The transformation was complete. The desperate young man sold to pay gambling debts had become one of the most influential business leaders in the rapidly expanding nation. Ophelia, now 72, but still formidable in her intelligence and determination, watched with undisguised pride as Bartholomew concluded negotiations that would establish railroad supply depots across 3 states. His mastery of complex financial arrangements and political relationships had exceeded even her ambitious expectations, while his partnership with Isadora had evolved into the kind of personal and professional collaboration she'd hoped for but never dared guarantee. The Hartwell Ravencrest Transportation Company will control supply lines from Chicago to San Francisco within 5 years, he announced, reviewing the contracts they'd just finalized. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion has created opportunities that dwarf everything we've accomplished so far. Isadora, now bearing the title of Executive Vice President and wearing the engagement ring that Bartholomew had presented 6 months earlier, studied maps that showed their expanding network of business interests. Their upcoming marriage with Ophelia's enthusiastic blessing would unite their professional partnership with the personal bond that had grown stronger through every challenge they'd faced together. The beauty of what you've both accomplished, Ophelia observed, pouring champagne to celebrate the day's success, is that you've learned to build power that serves purposes beyond simple accumulation. Your transportation company will connect communities. Your banking partnerships will finance development that benefits entire regions. And your political relationships will help shape policies that encourage responsible growth. The evening's celebration was interrupted by a telegram that brought news both expected and emotionally challenging. Ezekiel Hartwell had died peacefully at the family farm, his final years comfortable thanks to the financial security his son's marriage had provided. Bartholomew's feelings about his father remained complicated: gratitude for life lessons, mixed with resentment about the gambling addiction that had nearly destroyed everything but forgiveness had become possible, as his own success made their early struggles seem distant and manageable. He lived long enough to see that his son had become a man of significance, Ophelia said gently. Sometimes redemption takes forms we don't expect when we're struggling through the worst moments. The funeral in Millgrove provided Bartholomew with an opportunity to see how completely his circumstances had changed. The same townspeople who had witnessed his humiliation at being sold like property now treated him with deference bordering on awe. His obvious prosperity, combined with stories of his business accomplishments, had transformed local perception from pity to admiration. But it was during the quiet moments after the funeral, as he and Isadora walked through the countryside where he'd grown up, that Bartholomew fully appreciated the magnitude of what Ophelia's unconventional plan had accomplished. She saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself, Isadora observed as they paused beside the creek where he'd played as a child. But more than that, she gave you the education and opportunities to develop that potential into something remarkable. 3 months later, their wedding took place at Ravencrest Manor, with guests that included senators, railroad executives, and business leaders from across the continent. Ophelia, radiant in silver silk and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose most ambitious plans had succeeded beyond all expectations, served as matron of honor while presiding over ceremonies that celebrated both personal happiness and the continuation of enterprises she'd spent decades building. "When I purchased a husband to serve my business interests," she said during her toast at the wedding reception, "I never imagined I would gain a son and daughter whose partnership would exceed my own accomplishments." Bartholomew and Isadora, you represent the future of American enterprise, intelligent, ethical, and committed to building something larger than yourselves. As autumn painted the countryside in brilliant colors, the three partners reviewed plans that would extend their influence well into the 20th century. Educational initiatives, transportation networks, financial institutions, and political relationships formed an interconnected web of influence that could shape American development for generations. The boy who was forced into marriage at 25 has become a man who chooses his own destiny at 27, Ophelia observed with deep satisfaction. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings produce the most extraordinary results. Standing with his wife and business partner on the terrace of the manor that had become his true home, surrounded by the visible evidence of success beyond his wildest youthful dreams, Bartholomew understood that Ophelia's specific plans had accomplished something even she might not have anticipated. They had created not just wealth and influence, but a family bound together by mutual respect, shared purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful that will outlast any individual lifetime. The marriage that began as a business transaction had evolved into a legacy that would influence American development for decades to come.